who's going to give us a formal welcome here.
Thank you. As Francis said, my name is Mark Weber, and I'm president of Cleveland Peace Action. And I would like to welcome you to our Peace at the Pub presentation on Russia by Professor Todd Nelson. And a note to Professor Nelson before I continue. In your remarks, perhaps you could address the issue of the degree to which Cold War logic is still the principal animating force behind our foreign policy toward Russia. But we at Cleveland Peace Action are a local affiliate of Peace Action, the largest peace organization in the United States. It has its roots in the grassroots anti-nuclear and nuclear freeze movements of the 1970s and 80s. We're still here, and we are committed to ending a foreign policy based upon the Cold War assumptions of 40 years ago. We're also committed to nuclear disarmament and to meaningful diplomacy with countries like Iran and North Korea. We also are devoted to a genuine peace in Israel-Palestine. And in concrete terms, this means suspending our tradition of no strings attached, almost $4 billion per year annual gift of military hardware to Israel. And we also oppose and call for an end to the brutal occupation of the West Bank, and also an end to the embargo of Gaza. Underlying this position is, which is apparently the radical notion that indigenous Arabs of Palestine are human beings who are entitled to live in peace and dignity. And one more thing, please help us with a donation. Please visit the Cleveland Peace Action website for our address and send us a contribution. Also visit our Facebook page. And now please enjoy the remarks of Professor Todd Nelson. Elizabeth Cravagna, a member of our board, will introduce our speaker. And again, thank you for coming.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks, Francis. Okay, so Dr. Todd Nelson served as the Russian, German, Ukrainian linguist and interrogator for the Military Intelligence Corps for 3 years, U.S. Army. He spent 9 months deployed in Kosovo. He also is a subject matter expert on Russian affairs in the Global Organized Crime Project, which is now the Transnational Threats Initiative at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. He's the author of Bringing Stalin Back in Memory Politics and the Creation of Usable Past in Putin's Russia, which I think is very germane to what Mark was interested in. And I'm sure that you will find him to be an extremely informative and knowledgeable speaker, as well as, when I've heard him speak before, kind of funny. So with that, I give you Todd Nelson.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Thanks, everybody. I'm really pretty heartened that there's this much interest in Russia these days. And so I guess just by way of sort of introducing my remarks, I would say that I don't know that it's so much an issue of Cold War politics. I guess it is in the sense that there is sort of a fundamental misapprehension of what the Russian worldview is about. And that's sort of what I'm hoping to illuminate here a bit with my remarks. So I guess getting right into it, sure most people here are aware of the rather alarming conduct of the Russian state recently, with the annexation of Crimea in 2014, military intervention in Syria, and maybe most famously, interference in not only the US elections, but in elections in Europe, and sort of these sort of efforts to groom and elect candidates that Putin at least believes will be favorable to the to Russia. And so, as the title of, I guess, my presentation sort of hints at, the entirety of the mindset of the Russian elite has this sort of us against the world sort of worldview, right? Russia views itself as being constantly sort of under attack from without, particularly by the West and particularly by the United States within that. And so a lot of these machinations of Putin with election interference and that sort of thing, and putting military force in the Middle East, and has to do with this idea of projecting the image of Russia as a strong state, because that really resonates with a lot of the Russian people, particularly people who were alive to experience the unraveling of the Soviet Union and the dramatic loss of prestige and power that went along with that. And that's sort of, it's sort of hard to overstate the significance of that. If you think about it, it's, you know, you've had this ideology, this sort of guiding ideology for your entire life. And then all of a sudden, not only is that ideology completely discredited, but there's this massive contraction of the state in terms of power and state capacity, not to mention just economic chaos that was happening at the time. And that's a pretty tremendous blow to have to weather. And that was really difficult for a lot of Soviet citizens. And it's not, I guess it's not a very well-known fact that the majority of the Soviet people didn't want the Soviet Union to end. And so there's sort of, there's been a lot of nostalgia for the Soviet period. There was a lot of it, particularly during the Yeltsin period. And then it's sort of been manipulated and manufactured during the Putin era. So not to get too far ahead of myself here, I guess, talking about the end of the Soviet Union and the sort of the profound sort of sense of loss that accompanied that, and trauma. So the United States and the West in general did not do a very good job of sort of shepherding that transition from a market economy and a democratic political to a market economy and a democratic political system, from a centrally planned economy and the communist system. And I've heard that explained a number of different ways by a number of different people in Washington. I think the rough consensus is that the idea is that if you can destroy all of the vestiges of the Soviet state, then there will be nothing left to come back, right? That you just completely destroy that, and you then sort of build from the ground up, that it'd be easier to build a democratic society and a market economy that way. But that did not end up being a very good strategy. And a lot of that has to do with just really poor planning on the part of a lot of Western economists, and a sort of incestuous relationship between a lot of the American policymakers and some of the young sort of pro-Western reformers at the time, Anatoly Chubais and Boris Nemtsov in particular. And so also during this time, under President Clinton, NATO expanded right up to the borders of the Russian state, right, with the Baltic states and several of the Eastern European countries joining NATO. And it's important to put that in context, because if you look at the history of the Russian state, it has essentially been one catastrophic, devastating invasion after another, whether it's the Poles or the Swedes or the Teutons or the Mongols, and then 300 years of domination as part of the Golden Horde, to Napoleon, and perhaps best known, the Operation Barbarossa and the invasion by the Germans in 1941. So there's this sort of phobia, I guess, of invasion and sort of attack from without. That's sort of a constant theme in Russian history and in Russian politics. There's a lot of that sort of thing. And so after the collapse of Russia, or the Soviet Union, excuse me, in 1991, there was sort of this very profound national identity crisis, for lack of a better term, and that the Soviet state and the ideology that had been guiding it were just completely vaporized in really less than a year. And so, well, I guess that's not entirely true. There were sort of revelations prior to the unraveling of the Soviet Union that did a lot of damage to sort of the idea of the socialist state being sort of a ground up phenomenon. And it was very clear, particularly in the years 1988 to 1990, that it was a system held in place largely by fear. So all of this sort of contributed to this sense of loss, and there really wasn't anything that sort of replaced that. And so that was one of the things that Boris Yeltsin started very early on trying to do, was to cobble together some sort of new Russian national identity. And he largely did that by trying to append Russian national identity to, or anchor it to, the Tsars and the Romanov dynasty and what had existed before communism. Yeltsin was rather famously anti-communist. But that didn't really work, because the Romanovs were too far distant to really get any sort of traction in terms of any sort of viable national identity. And so the 1990s ended up being largely sort of a decade of chaos under Yeltsin. Yeltsin was impeached 3 times by the lower house of parliament, the Duma in Russia, although the Federation Council, which is the upper house of parliament, refused to sign off on that, so he stayed in power. But there was sort of, he was sort of casting about from one political crisis to another, and there was just sort of economic turmoil. There were several bouts of hyperinflation early on in the 1990s, and things didn't get really too much better than that. And that the Russian economy contracted every year until 1997 under Yeltsin. And then in 1998, the entire economy collapsed. And so they defaulted on IMF loans, and it ended up being sort of a big catastrophe. There was a joke actually at the time that was going around, I think this was 1994 when I was there, which said, what has Yeltsin been able to do in 3 years that the Communist Party hasn't been able to do in 70? And so the answer was, make communism look good. So, and so during this time, though, what started to develop was a very sort of grassroots nostalgia for the Soviet period, exactly what that joke refers to, because that it really did make communism look good to a lot of people. And so Yeltsin really was not very happy about that situation, and really did not do much to sort of encourage that. In fact, in the presidential election of 1996, when Yeltsin was running against Zyuganov, who was the Communist Party candidate, Yeltsin aired these rather famous commercials that said vote, that was vote or lose was the thing. And it would say vote, and it would show some people's feet playing tennis on a tennis court, and it would say or lose, and then it had sort of these jackboots marching, implying that this would be a return to the sort of worst of the Soviet state should the Communist Party candidate win. And so it was this sort of environment where Yeltsin basically handed the reins to Vladimir Putin, who was sort of an unknown quantity at the time. People didn't really know what to think of him. Excuse me, he had been first deputy prime minister, which is sort of the usual stepping point to running for president. But before that, he had been head of the FSB, and I think what a lot of people liked about him was that he's a very Soviet sort of guy, in that he was well known as being a station chief in Dresden during the Cold War for the KGB, and he sort of represented this law and order image that a lot of people found very attractive, particularly since, especially during the Yeltsin period, one of the more societal or societally visible problems that came along with this economic turmoil was a huge organized crime problem. Because as the state had contracted, organized crime groups basically stepped in to fulfill a lot of the functions that the state had fulfilled previously, such as enforcing contracts and that sort of thing. And so Putin came in, and unlike Yeltsin, Putin was a very pro-Soviet guy. And he made it known very early on that this sort of trashing things Soviet that had occurred under Yeltsin was not going to fly in his administration. And he set out to sort of forge a new Russian national identity that was very firmly rooted in the Soviet state. And so he had, his notion was sort of portraying the Soviet period as this era of Russian greatness. He did that really from the get-go. He almost immediately set about reforming, for example, the content of textbooks that were used in schools that at the time were very anti-Soviet. And Putin sort of put a stop to that and started looking for these narratives that were more patriotic and certainly more favorable to the Soviet Union. And so one of the ways that Putin went about doing this was rehabilitating the reputation of Stalin, which was a tricky thing to do, largely because in Russia there were, and there had been for quite a while, there were two images of Stalin. There was Stalin, the murderous tyrant, who sent 20 million people to the Gulag and had 1.2 million people executed. But then there was also the Stalin who brought the Soviet Union victory in World War II. And that was profoundly important to a lot of Soviet people. So these were actually two sort of events that that really touched most Soviet families in one way or another, were the Stalinist terror, and then what was called the Great Patriotic War, as World War II is known in Russian, and victory in that war over Germany. So there was a joke at this time also, when Putin sort of first came on the scene and first started making these overtures to Stalin. And the joke sort of goes, Putin initially is sort of having all these difficulties running Russia, and one night he's visited by the ghost of Stalin in a dream, and Putin says, Comrade Stalin, I could really use your advice on how I'm to rule Russia. And the ghost of Stalin says, round up all the Democrats and shoot them, and then paint the inside of the Kremlin blue. And Putin says, why blue? And Stalin goes, ha, I knew you wouldn't ask me about the first part. So there was a lot of sort of black humor about the sort of rehabilitating of Stalin. And so this had always sort of been a tricky issue in Soviet politics, as well as how to sort of reconcile these two images of Stalin. And largely that was done by just not talking about Stalin at all. But Putin viewed Stalin as a very important symbol, because what he ended up doing was sort of using Stalin as the face of the Soviet period, because he's certainly, for good or bad, the most easily recognized figure in recent Russian history. But so in order to do that, he sort of needed to figure out how he could deal with the issue of the two Stalins. And what he ended up doing was he took the narrative of the terror and they appended it to the war narrative. And what I mean by that is that, so the narrative then became, well, Stalin needed to modernize the country in advance of the coming war with Germany, because Stalin was wise and knew that this war was coming. And so he needed, a lot of labor in order to do this massive modernization. So Stalin, crafty Stalin, sort of signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in 1939 to buy some time, and had been using this army of convict labor to modernize Russia. There's absolutely not a whit of truth to this narrative. Most of or a lot of the projects that convict labor actually worked on really had a marginal effect on sort of the modernization effort. But it was a way to sort of to address the terror as this sort of unfortunate, tragic occurrence, but one that was necessary. That was maybe the overarching sort of thing, is that it was necessary. When I was doing field work in Russia about this, you would hear the Russian equivalent of, if you want to make an omelet, you have to break some eggs, which in Russian is, when one chops wood, chips fly. So you would hear that a lot when people would be talking about the terror and this sort of thing. And so I guess I should say a few words about the Great Patriotic War, because it's very significant that Putin and the Putin regime have sort of co-opted the narrative of World War II. Because World War II is without a doubt the most memorialized, ubiquitous event in Russian history. Like, nothing even comes close to that level of sort of memorialization and remembrance and solemnity, and it's taken very seriously by everyone, even back in, and it has been for even during Soviet times. Hedrick Smith, the sociologist, wrote a book in 1976 called The Russians, and he had a chapter in it called World War II Ended Yesterday. And that's what it is like still in Russia. It's like the war ended yesterday. To sort of give some context there, I guess, so during the war, the Soviet Union lost about 26 million people. More than half of those were civilians. So there were also, World War II sort of marked the beginning of what was known as the Holocaust by bullets, where the Nazi special purpose units came up behind the main army units and murdered Jews and Roma and Communist Party officials, but primarily Jews, 1.5 million in Ukraine alone, for example, and about 2 million if you include the Baltic states as well. During the 883-day siege of Leningrad during the war, 1.5 million people died, which was about half of the city's population. And to give, these numbers all sort of sound fantastical, but to give some context, America, the United States, in all of the wars it has ever fought, has lost slightly over 1 million men and women. So there are really some just absolutely outstanding numbers, and it's not hard to see why World War II is really such a big deal in Russia. But so what Putin sort of managed to do with this new narrative of the war was sort of, because nobody was really now trying to mask the fact that Stalin was this sort of brutal tyrant, excuse me, but it was sort of a, well, yes, Stalin may have been this brutal, this bloodthirsty bastard, but look at how he modernized the country. And we were able to win the war against Germany, given just tremendous odds, right? And so, so he was viewed as this sort of, he became this sort of miraculous, figure. And the implication of all of this was sort of, look at the feats that the strong centralized state is capable of, right? When you have a leader who really rules with an iron fist, look at what the state can do. And so that does a couple of things. It sort of implicitly justifies Putin's own brand of authoritarianism, because you would hear sort of the same sort of things about Putin in Russia, So for example, yes, Putin's he's a bit rough, but look at how he's modernized the country, right? It's the same sort of narrative that you would hear about Stalin, and that's not an accident. That is the way that things are. And the other is that this narrative sort of necessitates the idea of an attack from without, right? That the strong centralized state will protect you against these people who are trying to destroy Russia from without. That's really one of the sort of main strands that's woven into this narrative, because it allows Putin to create what's referred to as the rally effect, where people tend to rally around the leader of a state that is under attack. There's a crisis or something. And so Putin has sort of largely made a career out of the rally. If he's, I've jokingly referred to it as a perpetual rally effect that he has generated. And so because of that, it enables him to weather some pretty difficult circumstances. So when Russia is accused of shooting down a Malaysian airliner, right, and all these sanctions get slapped on it, Putin is able to say, see, this is the West trying to punish Russia for this or that. And he does the same, it's the same thing for election interference and anything that Russia is accused then of doing. Putin is able to sort of turn that around and use it to sort of justify his own brand of authoritarianism as necessary to protect the Russian people from these threats. I think that's really in the main sort of how the Russian worldview, at least at the top levels of politics in Russia, is working. This sort of, it's difficult to say precisely how much of this the Russian people buy. I think even 5 or maybe 10 years ago, it was a lot easier for people to sort of get on board with that narrative. And certainly Putin has done what he can to sort of limit groups that would oppose that narrative or contradict that narrative. There's been a number of what are referred to as memory laws enacted in Russia recently that sort of criminalize the public airing of narratives that sort of dispute the official line. So yeah, it's sort of, that's, I guess, sort of where we are today, is that so when the Russian people see Putin doing things like interfering in the US election, particularly in the 2016 election, they recognize that sort of for what it is. They see what Putin is trying to do, and they understand that that's what he is doing, but they view that as the sort of the best defense is a good offense type of thinking.
Mhm.
So with that, I guess I'll open it up to questions. That's pretty much my take on that.
Well, thank you, Todd. That was presented so clearly and sensibly.
Thank you.
I really appreciate your clarity on this. There was, I wonder if, while people are pondering a question, I wonder if Stephanie, could you make an announcement? Did you want to make an announcement about a letter regarding the air show? So I think people need to people are probably still formulating questions. So let me take that pause. Stephanie, can you unmute
Yes.
yourself?
Yeah. The Cleveland Nonviolence Network, we got all the names of the corporate sponsors and all of their addresses to like their CEOs and corporate headquarters. And we drafted a letter directed to the sponsors that we're going to be asking people and organizations to sign on to, asking the corporate sponsors not to sponsor the air show for myriad reasons, including the fact that it basically sanitizes, well, it's a military recruiting event, number one, and number two, it sanitizes what our machines of war and death and destruction do. In the United States, our fighter jets are viewed as entertainment, but as the Black and brown peoples all over the globe who have been victims of those fighter jets and bombs that they drop, they have a completely different perspective on those machines. They run for their lives when they hear those machines. And so we're asking the corporate sponsors not to sponsor the air show and to instead sponsor educational events to teach people nonviolent alternatives to resolving their conflicts. And so we're going to be bringing the letter to be signed at the August 6th Hiroshima Memorial event and invite you to please consider signing on.
Thank you, Stephanie. So, Todd, let me ask a question here. So one of the things that I've kind of caught up sort of in a big hole in my education over the last few years is to read classical Russian literature. And it strikes me that Russia has long had kind of an inferiority complex. I guess that would be the best way to put it. That somehow it was behind. It was less advanced than say than Western Europe, in particular France, and the idea that Russian nobility had the habit of speaking a lot of French in the 19th century. As if their own language wasn't good enough, which the literature certainly proves that it's quite good enough. But that's my sense is that they were always playing catch up with the West, and then so there's this identity conflict seems to go back a long way. I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's correct. And you sort of actually see that at various points throughout Russian history. Peter the Great, sort of a lot of his reforms had to do with importing Western, particularly European customs, and sort of displacing Russian customs with those. Certainly that was basically Stalin's whole rationale for modernizing, was we're so far behind that if we don't do something about it, we're going to be crushed. We're just going to disappear. And so that certainly motivated a lot of people to sort of work to industrialize. And I mean, I don't know, Putin does the same thing. And he actually said in an interview in 2007, he said something along the lines of, I'm paraphrasing, but it was something like, a lot of people in the West think that the Russians sort of need to be brought down from the trees and brushed out and stuff, and that they're these sort of savages. And so I think that is certain. There is certainly a history of that. Interestingly, however, and perhaps paradoxically, there's this idea that has gained a lot of currency, especially recently, of this sort of messianism in Russia. And the Russian Orthodox Church actually has had a lot to do with this. It's the sort of idea that Russia has this special place in the world, and if only sort of they would have the opportunity, they could really do great things for the world, and this sort of thing. So, I mean, these are all the sort of undercurrents that politicians play on, right? The people in power sort of are very acutely aware that these exist, and they sort of play on them to advance whatever particular agenda they favor.
We have a bunch of questions coming in here, so am I okay to start? This one is
Go
from,
ahead.
okay, Paul Hannawalt would like to know, why are you not mentioning the fact that the Soviet Union asked for our help to recover, and we sent a group of capitalists with Timothy Geithner over to steal billions of dollars of the Soviet people's money?
So actually, I sort of did say that the West did not make that transition any easier at all. And actually, there's a really interesting book. Now I can't remember who wrote it. It's called The Strange Case of Western Collision and Collusion. Goodness gracious, I can't remember who wrote it. Collision and Collusion, The Strange Case of Western Aid to Eastern Europe. And it sort of details that, not only that, but sort of the idea, and it's absolutely true, that in fact, Gorbachev asked the first President Bush for aid, and was pretty flatly refused, actually. And a lot of the US aid policies that then followed, particularly notorious was an organization known as the Harvard Institute for International Development, had these very sort of exploitative and self-serving, and there were a lot of conflicts of interest in the Harvard Institute for International Development incident. There were these two economists who were sort of running the whole thing, and their significant others. So these economists were in charge of choosing ventures that should receive aid. But then the significant others of these two economists were investment bankers who would then invest money in the projects that their husband and boyfriend in those cases chose. So it was an obvious conflict of interest, and it was a whole big scandalous thing. But that certainly is true. That that the I guess I should also maybe mention that it's sort of not entirely clear that this was this was done with malice necessarily, because a lot of the sort of transition model that was used in the Russian case, this what was referred to as economic shock therapy, where you would very quickly move from a centrally planned economy to a market economy. And this was championed by a lot of Western advisors, but it was championed because it worked really well in Poland. Poland obviously is not the Soviet Union, and that ended up being a sort of classic case of you can't really take one model and just graft it onto a country the size of Russia, and it backfired spectacularly. I don't know if I answered the question exactly, but I certainly did not mean to portray US aid or assistance to the Soviet Union in any sort of favorable light.
Okay, so this one's from David Gurin. Isn't NATO expansion a threat to Russia? Was it that similar to US view of Cuba as the threat when the Soviets placed missiles? The US has 800 bases around the world. How many bases do the Russians have outside of their country?
So working backwards, I don't know how many bases the Russians have around the world. What was the second part of that?
Isn't NATO expansion a threat to Russia, and was that similar to the US view?
Okay.
Yeah.
So the short answer there would be no, because the United States hasn't really experienced any sort of significant invasion. Whereas the Soviet Union and Russia has been invaded numerous times, as I mentioned, and the majority, maybe I'll go ahead and say the majority of those invasions were from the West, right? So Poland, Sweden, France, and Germany all invaded from the West. So it was a particularly sensitive issue for the Soviet Union, or Russia, the Russian Federation at that time, to have what was considered a former enemy, and I'll put that in quotes, but that a former enemy would be expanding its territory right up to the borders of the Russian Federation. I think that was, and it was maybe more a problem of perception, because this was happening also at a time when Russia was in no position whatsoever to do anything about it. So it's sort of, the optics were very bad in terms of that. But it's
okay. Stephanie asked, how do you think the international community should be responding to Putin's crimes like poisoning people?
Boy, that's a good question. I don't know. I really don't know. Because the evidence seems pretty incontrovertible, actually, on more than one case that the Kremlin is directly responsible for ordering the murder of both dissidents and opponents. One of the things, I guess the way that I would answer that is like this. Putin, like most Russian politicians, is a realist, and he has a fairly good idea of what he is able to get away with and what the West is willing to tolerate. And because there isn't that much else that we can do short of actually using some sort of military intervention at this point. Russia has had all manner of sanctions leveled against it. And the other, I guess, part of that is that the West also needs to be careful, because the Russian Federation still supplies Eastern and Western Europe with an awful lot of natural gas supplies that are used to heat homes and businesses and that sort of thing in the winter. Actually, I think in Eastern Europe, it's something like 2/3 of the natural gas is supplied by Russia. And in Western Europe, I think it's still about 1/3.
Wow.
So it's sort of Putin sort of knows where he sits in terms of that. So it's a very tricky thing. And there was a lot of discussion about that, actually, particularly when the annexation of Crimea was going on, because what are we, or what is anyone going to do about it? Are we willing to go to war? Well, that's a good question. Ukraine isn't a NATO member. It's not an EU member either, but the Baltic states are, both members of the EU and members of NATO. So there was a lot of consternation about perhaps Putin seeing how far he could go by annexing, I don't know, Lithuania or Latvia or Estonia.
Well, to that end, I have a quick question about Crimea. How do the Russian people feel about that? Do they look at that as he's protecting them and they belong to the Soviet Union in the first place?
Something like that. Most Russians view Ukraine as sort of part of ancient Russia. And so they consider that to be really in the Russian sphere of influence.
Okay, so to experience an invading army and air force, it is understandable that Russia ought to be fearful of being invaded again. Well, the US hasn't been invaded since 1812. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I think that's pretty accurate. You know, I guess the difference, however, would be that the United States really wasn't terribly sort of consolidated in the sort of state that we know today, right? Whereas Russia was invaded and occupied and sort of brutalized really not all that long ago, right, in the modern era. And so I think it's also, I guess, more of this idea that really, anybody who studies Russian history, it's just literally sort of one invasion after another. It isn't even just that one was particularly devastating, because they have all been pretty devastating.
Okay, how do you think the US should respond to the cybercrime attacks against the US government and US businesses and our critical infrastructure? And do you consider those an act of war?
That is also a good question. And I'm not really sure how to answer it. I mean, part of the problem here is that all states sort of do this to some extent. All states sort of seek to assist candidates that they would like to see elected. And certainly electronic warfare is not the sole province of the Russian Federation. They happen to be particularly good at it. But it's sort of difficult to say. There seems to be a bit of a question about, I guess I would need a little more specificity on exactly what we're talking about, because it's unclear, I guess, if some of the crimes against businesses, for example, are being perpetrated by the same actors that have been perpetrating electoral interference. But the electoral interference is mainly sort of the Russian military intelligence, the GRU, that is responsible for that sort of thing. It isn't just, by the way, cyber crime. I mean, it is cyber crimes, but it's also they actually have agents in the US who sort of work disinformation campaigns and that sort of thing. So it's a lot more sophisticated than just sort of hacking websites and that sort of thing. The political interference, anyway.
Would you consider those acts of war?
That's a tough call. I don't know what I would say about that. You would need some pretty compelling proof that that was being ordered by the Kremlin and the purposes that it was being ordered for.
Okay, here's an easier one for you. What is your best guesstimate as to Putin's net worth? Some say he could be the wealthiest man in the world, which would explain some of Trump's admiration.
He's certainly fabulously wealthy. Fabulously wealthy. If he has done nothing else in his career, he has made himself a very, very wealthy man.
What do you think of the idea that the West should start releasing some of his wealth information, like Navalny was doing that before he got locked up, like maybe 100 people letting the Russians know?
Well, I don't think anybody really, I mean, I could be wrong on this, but I don't think I mean, people can ballpark Putin's net worth, but I don't think that's something that he probably, you know, has on a CV somewhere or anything. I don't think he probably keeps that information fairly close to the vest. Wasn't that, I seem to recall that when the Panama Papers came out, that one of his childhood friends or something, this violin player, had all this fabulous wealth, and people were sort of making some sort of connection that he was like sort of a proxy for some of Putin's wealth. And I guess just, you know, my experience with Russian organized crime is that these people are pretty good at sticking money away places where it's not all that easy to find.
Okay, so should Interpol and the ICC be involved in response to Russia's poisoning of dissidents and opponents?
It would be just my opinion, but yes, my opinion would be yes. I think that's really, and that's, again, this is just me, but it has been demonstrated really very convincingly in British courts, especially, that the order to murder, for example, Litvinenko, who was poisoned with polonium, the polonium tea, that was ordered by Putin. That Putin was, at best, no, I guess at worst, was aware of it, I guess I would say. So it seems to me that it's pretty obvious that is happening. Again, though, I guess my caveat would be that it's hard to make a sort of judgment like that, because, and this is sort of, so this sort of thing goes on actually quite a bit. When we accuse Russia of, for example, violating human rights in Chechnya, Putin comes back with the sort of whataboutism of, well, at least, you know, we didn't drop 2 atomic bombs on civilian populations during a war, right? Which there's some merit to that argument, right? And so this sort of thing happens sort of the same way. Like Putin could sort of turn this around and say, well, you know, the Russian Federation isn't using drone strikes to extrajudicially murder people in areas of conflict. And there would be some merit to that argument too.
Okay, does Putin understand abrupt climate change as opposed to traditional slower climate change? That's from Dave Helm.
I have no idea. Just to be honest, I don't know.
He keeps that close to the vest too. All right.
He doesn't seem inordinately concerned about it, I guess.
Yeah. Okay. When Ukraine would not do Russia's bidding, Russia shut off the gas to Ukraine. Now Germany has a pipeline project to get Russian gas, and the U.S. doesn't like it. It could simply be shut off the gas to Germany, just like it did to Ukraine. And that's a comment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the energy warfare is definitely one of the tools that Putin has at his disposal. That's a very real possibility. I mean, it's again, you have to be careful not to cut off your nose to spite your face, because Russia desperately needs those revenues, particularly since it's being sanctioned almost everywhere else. Right? The oil and natural gas revenues are extremely important to the Russian economy. And the fact that prices have been, until fairly recently, a lot lower for both oil and natural gas has sort of, I guess, made Putin's position a little bit precarious, because Putin is in power because the powerful people around him want him to be in power. And when that is no longer the case, then Putin will not be in power.
Okay, according to a 1997 treaty and renewed in 2010, Russia has the rights to be stationed in Crimea based on the agreement between the Russian Federation and Ukraine on the status and conditions of the Russian Federation's Black Sea Fleet's stay
Right.
on Ukrainian territory. Is that
Mhm.
correct?
Yes, that is correct.
So why are we saying they invaded Crimea? Okay.
Black Sea Fleet has been stationed in Crimea since the Soviet time, since Soviet period.
Okay, we're always accusing Russia of human rights violations, yet we give Israel $4 billion a year to massacre Palestinians and steal their land. And the question is, why doesn't Russia point this out? But I think you've already answered that Russia loves to use, whataboutism back to us. Okay, we'd like a comment on, according to a 1997, oh wait, never mind. And what did Putin have on Trump? Financial dependence, real estate ventures? He likes to venture, I guess.
Oh boy, there are a lot of things I could say, I guess, about that. I'll be a little more sort of moderate and say, so first of all, I'll go ahead and say every single one of my sort of army buddies from military intelligence is of the opinion that Trump is compromised by Russian intelligence. There are all sorts of sort of ideas about what that might consist of. Certainly Trump is rumored to have Russian organized crime ties. Felix Deripaska is sort of a lot of the people that he does business with are sort of well-known, not very nice people. I guess any sort of VIP who stays in a really nice Russian hotel would be foolish to not think that they are under surveillance, would be another thing, I guess, that I would mention. But, I mean, who knows? There's a fairly long list of things that could be compromising.
Okay, and I'm sorry, I think I cut off you answering this question. So we're going to ask it again. We're always accusing Russia of human rights violations, yet we give Israel $4 billion a year to massacre the Palestinians and steal their land. Why doesn't Russia point this out?
I don't know. I think Russia has plenty of other examples of, the US sort of behaving badly. That's maybe not one that they sort of are interested in pointing out. In terms of the Middle East, Russia tends to sort of stick by a lot of its allies from the Cold War era. You sort of see that in Syria with sort of the good relations with Putin and Bashar, or at least not unfriendly relations, I guess. So I really don't know. I don't have a sort of good answer for that.
Well, I think that's all that I see in the message box. I certainly have a million notes and learned a lot. I do want to just make one quick comment that I noticed is, it seems like Putin does a lot of rewriting history and whitewashing, and it's kind of what's happening about January 6th here, and it sounds very Russian in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually, that's really sort of memory politics in action. Even, I guess, before the January 6th sort of situation, I mean, the memory politics issue for the United States is the Civil War and slavery. That's sort of our, what we have the biggest sort of internal controversy about how to portray history, right? And you see that sort of also with the 1619 project and these sort of the hostility to things like critical race theory and that sort of thing. That all seems to stem from race relations and the Civil War.
Hey, Todd, I have a comment and a question for you. And this sort of brings us back to the origins of peace action, which is in the nuclear freeze campaign. Because back then, Russian and American people were talking to each other to try to create a diplomatic bridge that the leaders didn't seem capable of doing. But it strikes me now that I mean we've painted Putin as a very calculating person who can't be trusted. But the one place I see an opening here is in nuclear weapons and arms control. I don't think Putin wants a nuclear war or would start a nuclear war. I don't think he likes to spend Russian rubles on building more nuclear weapons. And this is an interest that actually we share with Russia. And it seems like this is an opportunity for America to further cut nuclear weapon stockpiles, because we're the two biggest holders of nuclear weapons.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that. I mean, I don't know, my position is sort of that American military spending is grossly out of whack with the reality of American security needs. I think Putin probably is pretty savvy about the costs of those sorts of things as well. And it's just something that Putin seems more interested in sort of modernizing the Russian conventional forces. And so, yeah, no, I would agree that certainly nuclear issues are someplace where there's some progress that can be made. Also, I guess one of the other things that is sort of similar to the Cold War experience here is that really there aren't as many differences between the peoples of Russia, you know, between American and Russian people, just your average person. Right? It's the politics that is really that sort of creates this sort of, you know, fear and suspicion where it doesn't really need to exist. And that's, I guess, what I view as really the unfortunate sort of thing about the way that the Putin regime is using memory politics, is that it sort of creates this suspicion and fear where there really doesn't need to be any.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, if there aren't any other questions, I think there's a comment that says, "Thank you so much, Todd." I certainly echo that. I really appreciate your knowledge of this, of Russian history and how that helps us understand today. What do they say? If those who forget history are condemned to repeat it.
Indeed.
So we would do well to remember what we're dealing with. You know, the next time we, you know, make overtures to expand NATO to Russian borders, and
it'd be nice if we could have a do-over for sure.
Yeah.
I think a lot of things would be different.
Yeah. I mean, we're an island. It's a lot easier for us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Any other comments or questions or announcements before we close? Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming, and we hope to see you on August the 6th and on September the 14th. You'll be hearing more about those things. So thank you, Todd.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Have a good summer, everybody.
Thanks.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.